Schelling, A History of Modern Philosophy, Book 13. German philosophy is prolific of self-contradictions, and so far the most flagrant example has been offered by Fichte's theory of knowledge, starting as it does with the idea of an impersonal ego, developing through a process in which this selfless self demands its own negation at every step, and determined by the prospect of a catastrophe that would be the annihilation of consciousness itself. In fact, there seemed no need to wait until time had run out. The self, or as it was now called, the subject, had absorbed all reality, only to find that the material universe, reconstituted as the object of knowledge, was an indispensable condition of its existence. And meanwhile, the physical sciences, more particularly those concerned with inorganic nature, were entering on a series of triumphs unparalleled since the days of Newton. Philosophy must come to terms with these or cease to exist. The task of reconciliation was first attempted by F.W.J. Schelling, 1775 to 1854, a Swabian and the first South German who made a name in pure philosophy. Educated at the University of Tübingen, at an early age he covered an encyclopedic range of studies and began authorship at 19, gaining a professorship at Jena 4 years later. Wandering about from one university to another and putting forward new opinions as often as he changed his residence, the young adventurer ceased to publish after 1813 and remained silent till in 1841 he came forward at Berlin as the champion of a reactionary current, practically renouncing the naturalistic pantheism by which his early reputation had been made. But he utterly failed in the attempt, which was finally abandoned in the 5th year from its inception. Lewis, who saw Schelling in his old age, describes him as remarkably like Socrates. His admirers called him a modern Plato, but he had nothing of the deep moral earnestness that characterized either, nor indeed was morality needed for the work that he actually did. This, to use the phrase of his fellow student Hegel, consisted in raising philosophy to its absolute standpoint, in passing from the subjective moralism of the 18th century to the all-comprehensive systematization of the 19th. Schelling began as a disciple of Fichte, but he came simultaneously under the influence of Spinoza, whose fame had been incessantly spreading through the last generation in Germany, with some reinforcement from the revived name of Bruno. Their teachings served to make the latent pantheism of Fichte more explicit, while the great contemporary discoveries gave a new interest to the study of nature, which Fichte, unlike Kant, had put in the background, strictly subordinating it to the moral service of man. Had he cared to evolve the idea of a camel from his moral consciousness, the operation would not have demanded several years, but only a few minutes' thought. As thus, the moral development of humanity needed the cooperation of such a race as the Semites. To form their character, a long residence in the Arabian deserts was needed. But for such nomads, an auxiliary animal would be needed with long legs and neck, a stomach for storing water, hump, etc. Q.E.D. Schelling also began by explaining the material world as a preparation for the spiritual, only he did not employ the method of teleological adaptation, but a method of rather fanciful analogy. As the evolution of self-conscious reason had proceeded by a triple movement of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, so a parallel process had to be discovered in the advance towards a consciousness supposed to be exhibited in organic and inorganic nature. The fundamental idea of natural philosophy is polarity, opposite forces combining to neutralize one another and then parting to be reunited at a higher stage of evolution. Thus, attraction and repulsion, represented as space and time, by their synthesis compose matter. Magnetism and electricity produce chemical affinity. Life results from a triad of inorganic forces. In life itself, productivity and irritability give birth to sensibility. The order of the terms made little, if any, difference. When long afterwards iron was magnetized by the electric current, Schelling claimed for himself the credit of anticipating this discovery, although he had placed magnetism before electricity. The next step was to construct a philosophy of history. This, with much else, is included under the name of a system of transcendental idealism, 1800, in the most finished of Schelling's literary compositions. History, according to the view here unfolded, is the gradual self-revelation of God, or the Absolute, in whom nature and spirit are united and identified, who never is, nor can be, but always is to be. Meanwhile, the supreme ideal is not that ever-increasing mastery of nature by man which Fichte contemplated, but their reconciliation as achieved by art. For just as natural philosophy carried an element of consciousness into the material universe, so aestheticism recognizes a corresponding element of unconscious creation in the supreme works of artistic genius where spirit reaches its highest and best. Here, Schelling appears as the philosopher of Romanticism, a movement that characterized German thought from 1795 to 1805, and it is known to ourselves by the faded and feeble image of it exhibited in a certain section of English society nearly a century later. Beginning with a more cultivated intelligence of Hellenic antiquity, this movement rapidly grew into a new appreciation of medieval culture, falsely supposed to have given more scope to individuality than modern civilization, and then into a search for ever-varying sources of excitement or distraction in the whole history, art, and literature of past or present times, religion being at last singled out as the vitalizing principle of all. Singularly enough, Fichte accepted the transcendental idealism as an orthodox exposition of his own philosophy, but its composition seems to have given Schelling the consciousness of his own independence. Soon afterwards, he defined the new position as a philosophy of identity, or of indifference. Nature and spirit, like Spinoza's thought and extension, were all the same and all one, that is to say, in their totality, or in the absolute. For, considered as appearances, they might present quantitative differences determined by the varying preponderance of the objective or of the subjective side. In this way, Schelling found himself able to repeat his fanciful construction of the forces and forms of nature in successive triads under new names. The essential departure from Fichte, who repudiated the philosophy of identity with undisguised contempt, was that it practically repudiated the idea of an eternal progress in man's ever-growing mastery of nature. But in spite of all disclaimers, the master silently followed his former disciples' evolution in the direction of a pantheistic monism. His later writings represent God no longer as the moral order of the world, but, like Spinoza, as the world's eternal being, of which man's knowledge is the reflected image. Finally, both philosophers accepted the Christian doctrines of the fall, the Incarnation, and the Trinity as mythical symbols of an eternal process, in which God, after becoming alienated from himself in the material universe, returns to himself in man's consciousness of identity with the Absolute. Instead of the rather abrupt method of position, negation, and reaffirmation known as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, we have here the more fluid process of a spiral movement, departing from and returning to itself. And this was to be the very mainspring of the system that next comes up for consideration.